2:45 p.m., October cold, Millbrook, Ohio. Marcus Thompson gripped his steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, watching million-dollar machines die behind factory gates while billion-dollar solutions screamed inside his skull. The 42-year-old mechanic clutched a crumpled resume with hands that had once revolutionized Tesla's production lines. His faded white shirt and decade-old tie a cruel disguise over genius that nobody wanted to hire. His calloused fingers trembled against the worn Tesla watch. The last ghost of a life he'd murdered 5 years ago when Sarah's funeral ended everything. Through rust-stained windshield glass, he studied the failing factory like a surgeon examining a patient, seeing exactly how to save 400 jobs while his own daughter ate dollar store cereal for dinner. The bitter irony burned his throat. The same hands begging for $60,000 had once commanded systems worth hundreds of millions. "I don't need this job," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying the weight of buried brilliance. "I need a damn miracle." Millbrook Manufacturing stood like a dying giant against the gray Ohio sky, its 1950s brick facade crumbling under decades of Midwest winters and corporate neglect. The factory had once been the heartbeat of this 15,000-person town, churning out automotive parts that built America's highways, but now it gasped for breath like an old man climbing stairs. Marcus knew every bolt and bearing inside those walls would soon fall silent forever, taking with it the last hope this forgotten corner of America had left. He'd grown up here, met Sarah at the county fair just 2 blocks away, buried her in the cemetery visible from the factory's north parking lot. The cruel mathematics of his life had led him back to this moment, a 42-year-old widower with a 10-year-old daughter, $1,500 in the bank, and a pickup truck held together by prayer and duct tape. The interview had lasted exactly 12 minutes. Marcus had sat across from 3 men in cheap suits who looked at his 5-year employment gap like it was a contagious disease, their questions revealing they understood machinery about as well as fish understood bicycles. They dismissed his ideas about retrofitting the antiquated production line with modern automation, claiming they needed recent experience in large-scale manufacturing, not theoretical knowledge from someone who fixes lawnmowers. The irony would have been funny if his daughter's dinner didn't depend on it. These same executives were about to lose 400 jobs because they couldn't see the forest for the trees, couldn't recognize that the man sitting across from them had once designed the very systems that could save their company. Marcus had walked out with his dignity intact and his future in ruins, the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders like an old coat. Emma would be home from school in an hour, and Marcus dreaded the conversation they'd have to have. His 10-year-old daughter had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn optimism, but even she couldn't ignore the stack of overdue bills on their kitchen table, or the way her father's smile never quite reached his eyes anymore. She'd ask about the interview, with that hopeful expression that broke his heart daily, and he'd have to tell her they'd keep living paycheck to paycheck, keep worrying about every unexpected expense, keep pretending everything was fine. The worst part wasn't the poverty. It was watching Emma grow up too fast, shouldering worries that belonged to adults while her father felt increasingly useless. Marcus rubbed the Tesla watch face with his thumb, a nervous habit he'd developed since Sarah's death, and wondered how much longer he could keep failing the people who needed him most. That's when he noticed the woman standing across the street, watching the factory with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. She wore an expensive black coat that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, her silver hair pulled back in a style that whispered money and power. Something about her posture suggested she wasn't just another curious passerby. She studied the building like she was calculating its worth, evaluating its potential, seeing possibilities where others saw only problems. Marcus found himself intrigued despite his misery, wondering what someone with her obvious wealth was doing in a dying town like Millbrook. When their eyes met across the street, she held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than politeness allowed, as if she was reading something in his face that he didn't know was written there. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus with the unsettling feeling that their brief encounter meant something he couldn't yet understand. The woman's BMW broke down 3 days later, right in front of Jim's auto repair where Marcus spent his days fixing other people's problems while his own remained unsolvable. Jim Morrison had owned the garage for 30 years, and his arthritic hands could no longer handle the delicate work that modern engines demanded, making Marcus indispensable despite his overqualification. The job paid $2,800 a month, barely enough to keep them afloat, but better than nothing in a town where opportunities had died with the steel mills. Marcus was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild when the silver-haired woman pushed through the shop's glass door, her presence immediately elevating the shabby garage like a museum piece in a thrift store. She introduced herself as Victoria, spoke with the crisp confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, and explained that her car had simply stopped running on Main Street. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and followed her outside, already hearing the problem before he lifted the hood. "Your alternator's gone," Marcus said after 30 seconds of listening to the engine, "but that's not your real problem. You've got maybe 2 weeks before your transmission starts slipping, and your brake pads are down to metal." Victoria raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical that someone could diagnose multiple problems so quickly, but Marcus had learned to trust his instincts about machines. They never lied the way people did. He spent the next hour replacing her alternator with surgical precision, explaining each step in language she could understand, while his mind automatically cataloged a dozen other improvements the BMW needed. Victoria watched him work with an attention that felt different from normal customer curiosity, asking questions that revealed a sharper technical understanding than most people possessed. When he finished, she insisted on paying double his quoted price, claiming his diagnosis had probably saved her thousands in repair bills. Marcus tried to refuse the extra money, but Victoria pressed the cash into his palm with a smile that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being argued with. Emma arrived just as Victoria was preparing to leave, bursting through the garage door with the explosive energy that 10-year-olds brought to everything they did. "Dad, can you help me with my science project tonight? We're building bridges that can hold weight, and I want to make mine unbreakable." Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus felt his first genuine smile in days as he introduced his daughter to their unexpected customer. Victoria's entire demeanor shifted when she saw Emma, her corporate composure melting into something warmer and more vulnerable, as if the sight of a happy child had unlocked something carefully hidden. She asked Emma about her project with genuine interest, suggesting engineering principles that made the little girl's eyes light up with possibility. "Your father must be very proud of having such a smart daughter," Victoria said, but her eyes were on Marcus when she spoke, reading his face with that same unsettling intensity he'd noticed outside the factory. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that neither could quite name, but both recognized as significant. The next few weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm, with Victoria finding reasons to return to the garage with increasing frequency. Sometimes her car needed minor adjustments. Sometimes she claimed to be lost and needed directions, and once she brought coffee and pastries from the fancy bakery 2 towns over, saying she'd ordered too much for one person. Marcus found himself looking forward to these visits despite his better judgment, drawn to conversations with someone who could discuss complex engineering problems without glazing over or changing the subject. Victoria never mentioned what she did for work, deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone practiced at maintaining privacy, but her knowledge of manufacturing processes suggested significant experience in industrial settings. Marcus began to suspect she was some kind of consultant or investor, someone with the resources to fix problems that seemed insurmountable to ordinary people. The mystery intrigued him more than he cared to admit, especially when he caught her studying him with that calculating expression that suggested she knew more about him than she was revealing. Emma had adopted Victoria as an honorary aunt, the way children do when they encounter adults who take them seriously. Victoria never spoke down to her, never dismissed her questions as childish, and Emma responded by sharing the kind of innocent observations that cut straight to the heart of adult complications. "Dad used to work somewhere really important," Emma told Victoria one afternoon while Marcus was under the hood of a Chevy. "But he won't talk about it. I think he misses it more than he admits." Marcus froze, tools suspended mid-motion, wondering how his 10-year-old daughter had seen through carefully constructed walls that had fooled everyone else. Victoria's response was equally careful, But Marcus caught the note of genuine curiosity in her voice when she asked Emma what made her think that. "He gets this look sometimes when he's working," Emma explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children possessed, "like he's remembering something beautiful that he lost." The conversation haunted Marcus for days, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding about the life he'd abandoned and the man he'd chosen to become. The facade began cracking the day Marcus found Victoria at the town meeting about Millbrook Manufacturing's future. He'd attended out of curiosity and civic duty, expecting to hear the usual promises about economic development that politicians made when entire communities faced extinction. Instead, he found himself staring at Victoria from the back of the crowded high school auditorium, watching her sit in the front row like she belonged there, taking notes during presentations about the factory's declining productivity and mounting losses. The company's executives spoke in corporate euphemisms about restructuring and right-sizing, but everyone understood they were discussing the death of their town. Marcus studied Victoria's profile, noting how she listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the technical details being discussed, someone who could follow conversations about production quotas and automation investments without translation. When the meeting ended, she disappeared before he could approach her, leaving him with questions that multiplied like cancer cells in his mind. Emma found the old Tesla blueprints 3 days later, hidden in a box Marcus thought he'd destroyed years ago. She brought them to him with the excited expression of an archaeologist who'd discovered treasure, spreading the technical drawings across their kitchen table like maps to buried gold. "Dad, what are these? They look like robot designs." Emma's questions came in rapid-fire succession, each one driving deeper into secrets Marcus had worked so hard to bury. The drawings showed automated assembly systems he'd designed for Tesla's Gigafactory, innovations that had revolutionized electric vehicle production and earned him recognition as one of the brightest engineering minds of his generation. Looking at his old work through Emma's eyes, Marcus felt the familiar ache of abandoned dreams, the weight of potential squandered by grief and self-imposed exile. He tried to deflect her questions, claiming the drawings were just old-school projects, but Emma's intelligence made deception impossible. "Google says you used to work for Tesla," she announced with devastating honesty, showing him search results on her tablet. "It says you were famous." The confrontation that followed was inevitable and brutal. Emma demanded to know why her father had hidden such an important part of himself, why he'd abandoned a career that could have given them financial security and professional respect. Marcus found himself trying to explain concepts that adults struggled with: guilt, responsibility, the weight of decisions that rippled through time like stones thrown in still water. He told her about Sarah's accident, about the phone call that came while he was in a meeting he couldn't leave, about arriving at the hospital too late to say goodbye. Emma listened with tears in her eyes, her 10-year-old heart breaking for the father who'd been carrying this burden alone for 5 years. "But Mom wouldn't want you to stop being amazing," she whispered, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a dam holding back years of suppressed grief and self-recrimination. They cried together at their kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of the life he'd thrown away, while outside their window, Millbrook continued its slow descent into economic oblivion. Victoria's true identity revealed itself like a photograph developing in chemical solution, slowly and then all at once. Marcus discovered it by accident, researching automation solutions for a customer's manufacturing problem and stumbling across a Forbes article about Chen Industries, one of the world's largest automotive part suppliers. There was Victoria's face in a corporate headshot, identified as Victoria Chen, CEO and founder of a company that employed over 50,000 people across 3 continents. The article detailed her rise from engineering student to industrial titan, her reputation for identifying struggling companies and transforming them into profitable enterprises through strategic automation investments. Marcus read with growing amazement and growing dread, understanding that every moment of their friendship had been built on deception, that Victoria had been studying him like a business opportunity rather than connecting with him as a person. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected, poisoning memories of conversations he'd treasured and moments he'd thought were genuine. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday that started like any other, with Victoria arriving at the garage for what she claimed was a routine oil change. Marcus waited until they were alone, Jim having stepped out for lunch, before spreading the Forbes article across his workbench like evidence in a trial. "So, Victoria Chen, CEO of Chen Industries," he said with carefully controlled anger. "When exactly were you planning to tell me who you really are?" Victoria's composure cracked for the first time since he'd known her, her corporate mask slipping to reveal something vulnerable underneath. She didn't deny the deception, didn't offer weak excuses or hollow apologies, but simply stood there accepting his anger like someone who'd known this moment was inevitable. "I needed to understand who you really were," she said finally, her voice carrying a weariness that suggested this conversation was as difficult for her as it was for him. "Corporate relationships are performances. I wanted to know the man behind the resume before I offered you the opportunity that could change everything." The opportunity, as Victoria explained it, was both simple and impossible. Chen Industries was considering acquiring Millbrook Manufacturing, but only if they could find a way to modernize the facility's outdated production systems without replacing the entire workforce. Victoria had been studying the factory for months, running financial models and consulting with engineering firms, but every solution required capital investments that exceeded the plant's potential value. Then she'd seen Marcus outside the factory after his failed interview, had researched his background and discovered his Tesla connection, had realized that the solution to her industrial puzzle might be sitting in a small-town garage feeling sorry for himself. "I can give you 2 days," she said with the directness that had built her empire. 2 days to prove you can save that factory with your automation designs. If you succeed, I'll make you Chief Technology Officer of the Millbrook operation at $150,000 a year. If you fail, the plant closes and 400 people lose their job. Marcus felt trapped between impossible choices, each path leading to different forms of destruction. Accepting Victoria's challenge meant risking public failure, exposing himself to the kind of pressure and scrutiny that had driven him into exile 5 years ago. Rejecting it meant watching his neighbors lose their livelihoods while he possessed the knowledge that could save them. The weight of 400 families pressed against his chest like physical force. But so did the memory of Sarah's funeral, and his promise to himself that Emma would never experience the kind of loss that came from having an absent father. Victoria watched him struggle with the decision, her expression unreadable but patient, like someone accustomed to waiting while others wrestled with life-changing choices. "Why does it have to be me?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you're the only person in this town who understands both the technical requirements and the human cost," Victoria replied. "Because you've already lost everything once, so you know what's really worth saving." The phone call from Tesla came that same evening, a coincidence so perfectly timed it felt like cosmic intervention. Robert Kim, Marcus's former supervisor and current director of advanced manufacturing, had tracked him down through old employment records and professional networks. Tesla was expanding their Cybertruck production and needed experienced engineers who understood both automation systems and rapid prototyping methodologies. They were offering Marcus a position as senior manufacturing engineer at $200,000 annually, plus stock options that could set him and Emma up for life. Robert's voice carried genuine excitement as he described the project's scope and importance, the chance to work on technology that would define the next generation of sustainable transportation. "We never replaced you," Robert admitted during their hour-long conversation. "Nobody else could see the elegant solutions you found in impossible problems. Elon still asks about you sometimes." Emma overheard enough of the phone conversation to understand that their lives stood at a crossroads, that the father she'd watched struggle for 5 years suddenly had opportunities that could transform their circumstances overnight. She found Marcus sitting on their front porch after he'd ended the call, staring at the factory lights visible across town, while wrestling with decisions that would echo through their remaining years together. "Are we moving to California?" she asked, with the direct honesty that children brought to adult complications, settling beside him on the worn wooden steps. Marcus explained both opportunities as best he could, watching his daughter's face cycle through emotions too complex for her age. Excitement about financial security, fear about leaving the only home she'd known, confusion about why such good things felt so complicated. "What do you want to do, Dad?" Emma asked finally, and Marcus realized he'd been waiting for permission he didn't need to make choices he couldn't avoid. The decision crystallized during Emma's soccer game that Saturday. As Marcus watched families throughout the bleachers grapple with uncertainty about their futures, while their children played with the innocent energy that made every moment feel eternal. Jim Morrison sat 2 rows down, his arthritis-gnarled hands clapping for goals while his eyes held the worried expression of a man who'd built his life around a community that might not exist much longer. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store cheered for her grandson while calculating how many months she could keep her store open if half her customers moved away seeking employment. These people had welcomed Marcus and Emma with genuine warmth when they'd arrived, broken and desperate 5 years ago, had created space for them in a community that understood loss and resilience in equal measure. The thought of abandoning them for personal advancement felt like betrayal, but so did refusing opportunities that could secure Emma's future. Marcus found himself caught between competing loyalties, each choice demanding sacrifices that would reshape his understanding of himself. Victoria appeared at the game's halftime, settling beside Marcus in the bleachers with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her welcome anywhere. She watched Emma play with obvious admiration, commenting on the girl's strategic thinking and competitive spirit, but Marcus sensed deeper currents in their conversation. "She reminds me of someone I used to know," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying emotional weight that transformed her corporate persona into something more human. The admission hung between them like a bridge Marcus hadn't known existed, opening space for honesty that their previous interactions had carefully avoided. Victoria began talking about her own daughter, a brilliant 10-year-old who died in a car accident 8 years ago, a loss that had driven Victoria into workaholism and emotional isolation as protection against future pain. "I see Anna in Emma, sometimes," she confessed. "The same curiosity, the same fearless intelligence. It's been both wonderful and torture getting to know you both." The revelation recontextualized everything Marcus thought he understood about Victoria's motivations, transforming her business proposition from corporate manipulation into something approaching desperate hope. She wasn't just trying to save a failing factory or recruit an untalented engineer. She was trying to reconstruct some version of the family life that grief had stolen from her. Marcus recognized the pattern because he'd lived it himself. The way loss could drive people to build walls that became prisons, the way professional success could mask personal devastation until the two became indistinguishable. They sat in the bleachers sharing the kind of painful honesty that only fellow survivors could offer each other, watching their respective versions of moving forward play out on a soccer field where 10-year-olds chased dreams with the intensity of people who hadn't yet learned that dreams could be broken. "I need this to work," Victoria admitted as Emma scored a goal that sent their section of bleachers into celebration. "I need to believe something good can still come from all the things we've lost." Marcus made his decision during the sleepless hours after midnight, pacing his small house while competing futures battled in his imagination. Tesla represented safety, prestige, the chance to return to the career path that had once defined his identity and purpose. Working for Victoria meant embracing uncertainty, risking public failure, taking responsibility for outcomes that would affect hundreds of families he'd grown to care about. The smart choice was obvious, the safe choice even more so. But Marcus had learned that the most important decisions often contradicted both wisdom and security. He thought about Sarah's voice in the months before her death, how she'd talked about legacy and purpose, about the difference between success and significance. She'd believed that talent was a form of stewardship, that people with rare abilities bore responsibility for using them in service of something larger than personal advancement. Emma would be fine in California, would thrive in schools that challenged her intelligence and ambition, but she'd also learned that running away was sometimes easier than standing firm when circumstances became difficult. The morning of his deadline dawned gray and cold, October asserting its dominance over the Ohio landscape with the kind of weather that made everyone contemplate mortality and the passage of time. Marcus arrived at the factory before sunrise, using access codes Victoria had provided to explore the facility's machinery and infrastructure with the intensity of a doctor examining a patient. The production lines were older than he'd expected, some dating back to the 1980s, but their basic architecture remained sound beneath layers of neglect and makeshift repairs. Marcus spent 4 hours mapping every system, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies, calculating the potential impact of strategic automation investments. The math was daunting but possible. Retrofitting the facility would require creative engineering and careful resource management, but the fundamental concept was viable. More importantly, the human element remained strong. The workers he met possessed decades of experience and genuine pride in their craftsmanship, qualities that no amount of technology could replace or replicate. Emma arrived with Victoria around noon, carrying a thermos of coffee and sandwiches like she was supporting a military operation rather than an engineering assessment. Marcus had been working non-stop, filling notebooks with calculations and sketches, his mind firing on cylinders that had been idle for 5 years. Watching him in his element, Victoria saw glimpses of the man who'd once revolutionized Tesla's production systems, the engineer whose innovations had earned industry recognition and peer admiration. Emma saw something different but equally important. Her father engaged with purpose again, his natural intensity focused on problems worthy of his capabilities. "Dad looks happy," she whispered to Victoria, and they both recognized the truth in her observation. Marcus wasn't just solving technical puzzles. He was remembering who he'd been before grief had convinced him that caring deeply about anything was too dangerous to risk. The breakthrough came at 4:30 in the afternoon, when Marcus realized that the factory's apparent weakness, its hodgepodge of different ERA machinery, could actually become its greatest strength with proper integration. Instead of replacing everything with expensive new equipment, he could design modular automation systems that enhanced existing capabilities while preserving the skilled workforce that gave Millbrook Manufacturing its competitive advantage. The solution would require precise coordination between human expertise and machine efficiency, creating a hybrid production environment that combined the best aspects of traditional craftsmanship with modern technological capabilities. Marcus felt the familiar rush of creative synthesis, the moment when complex problems suddenly revealed elegant solutions that seemed obvious in retrospect. He called Victoria and Emma over to his makeshift workstation, spreading blueprints and calculations across a cafeteria table while explaining his vision with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rediscovered their reason for existing. Victoria studied the designs with the shrewd attention of someone who'd built her fortune on recognizing viable opportunities disguised as impossible challenges. Marcus's automation concept was brilliant in its simplicity, leveraging existing infrastructure while introducing strategic improvements that would dramatically increase efficiency and quality control. The financial projections were compelling. Implementation costs would be significant but manageable, with potential returns that justified the investment within 18 months. More importantly, the plan preserved jobs while creating pathways for workforce development, transforming Millbrook Manufacturing from a dying relic into a model for sustainable industrial evolution. "This could work," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of cautious optimism that successful executives brought to promising ventures. More than that, this could change how entire industries think about modernization versus replacement. Emma didn't understand all the technical details, but she understood that her father had found something worth fighting for again. The presentation took place in the factory's main conference room, with Millbrook Manufacturing's executives, union representatives, and key community leaders gathered around a table that had hosted countless discussions about the plant's declining prospects. Marcus had spent the previous evening preparing visual aids and financial projections, transforming his napkin sketches into professional presentations that conveyed both technical sophistication and practical accessibility. Victoria introduced him simply as a consultant with extensive automation experience, allowing his ideas to speak for themselves without the baggage of his employment gap or current circumstances. Marcus felt the familiar pre-presentation anxiety that had once preceded his biggest Tesla meetings, but underneath the nervousness lay confidence born from genuine expertise and careful preparation. These people needed hope more than they needed corporate diplomacy, and Marcus intended to deliver both in equal measure. The reaction was everything Marcus had hoped for and more. Plant managers who'd dismissed him weeks earlier now leaned forward with intense attention. asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Union representatives, initially skeptical about automation that might eliminate jobs, began to see opportunities for workforce development and skill enhancement that could secure their members' futures rather than threaten them. Financial officers ran quick calculations on implementation costs versus potential savings, their expressions shifting from pessimistic resignation to cautious excitement as the numbers revealed viable pathways to profitability. Marcus answered every question with the combination of technical expertise and practical wisdom that came from years of solving similar problems in high-pressure environments. He wasn't just selling a business plan, he was offering a vision of industrial renewal that honored both human dignity and economic necessity. Victoria's formal offer came 3 days later, delivered over dinner at the only restaurant in Millbrook that served anything more sophisticated than diner food. She had restructured the deal based on Marcus's presentation and the positive response from factory leadership, offering him a position as Chief Technology Officer with equity participation that could make him genuinely wealthy if the modernization succeeded. More importantly, she'd secured approval for a comprehensive workforce development program that would train existing employees to operate and maintain the new automated systems, ensuring that technological progress enhanced rather than replaced human expertise. Marcus listened to the details while Emma colored on kids' menus beside them, occasionally interjecting questions that revealed she'd been paying closer attention to adult conversations than anyone realized. "So, Dad would be the boss of all the robots?" she asked, with 10-year-old directness, and Victoria laughed with genuine warmth for the first time since Marcus had known her. "Something like that, sweetheart." The signature moment came not in a boardroom or legal office, but in Marcus's kitchen on a Sunday morning, when Emma made pancakes while he and Victoria reviewed contract details over coffee that actually came from decent beans rather than whatever Jim kept in the garage. The normalcy of the scene felt revolutionary after years of survival mode, the possibility of stability and purpose combining into something that resembled hope. Marcus signed the agreement with the same careful attention he brought to mechanical problems, understanding that his decision would echo through hundreds of lives beyond his own. Victoria countersigned, with the swift confidence of someone accustomed to transforming theoretical possibilities into practical realities. But her expression carried emotional weight that went far beyond business considerations. Emma insisted on adding her own signature to the document, claiming she was an important stakeholder in her father's career decisions, and neither adult had the heart to argue with her logic. The first month of implementation moved with the controlled chaos that characterized all significant transitions, as Marcus split his time between designing automation systems and managing the complex human dynamics that accompanied technological change. Some veteran workers resisted the new methods, despite their job security guarantees, clinging to familiar routines even when superior alternatives became available. Younger employees embraced the changes with enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded their competence, requiring patient coaching to develop skills that matched their ambition. Marcus found himself serving as translator between technological possibilities and human limitations, designing systems that enhanced worker capabilities rather than replacing them entirely. The work demanded every skill he'd developed during his Tesla years, plus emotional intelligence he'd learned through grief and single parenthood. Victoria proved to be an ideal partner, handling financial and administrative challenges while trusting Marcus's technical judgment completely. Emma thrived in the new environment, spending after-school hours at the factory learning about manufacturing processes and engineering principles from workers who treated her like a beloved mascot. She developed particular friendships with Maria Santos, a quality control supervisor who taught her Spanish while they tested product samples, and Frank Morrison, Jim's cousin, who operated the main assembly line and possessed encyclopedic knowledge about machinery that predated computer controls. Emma's natural curiosity and fearless questions endeared her to employees, who'd initially viewed the modernization with suspicion, and her presence served as a living reminder that the changes were designed to benefit families rather than abstract corporate interests. Marcus watched his daughter bloom with the confidence that came from being valued for her mind, rather than protected from adult complexities, and he realized that their new circumstances were transforming her as much as they were transforming him. Victoria's transformation was subtler but equally profound, as professional success began to fill emotional voids that had been hollowed out by years of grief and isolation. She spent increasing amounts of time in Millbrook rather than her corporate headquarters, claiming operational necessity but clearly drawn by personal connections that had been missing from her life since Anna's death. Her relationship with Emma developed carefully but authentically, neither woman trying to replace irreplaceable relationships, but both finding comfort in affection that honored their respective losses while creating space for new attachments. Marcus watched Victoria discover the simple pleasures of small-town life. Friday night football games, community potlucks, conversations where business success mattered less than personal character. The woman who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms seemed genuinely happy helping Emma with science projects, or listening to Marcus explain technical problems over dinner that lasted until Emma fell asleep at the kitchen table. The crisis came 6 months into implementation, when a competing automotive supplier offered Millbrook Manufacturing's biggest customer a contract that undercut their pricing by 20% through offshore production. Marcus learned about the threat during a Monday morning meeting that felt like a funeral, as plant managers explained that losing the Hendricks Corporation account would eliminate 60% of their revenue and make the modernization project financially unsustainable. The automation systems were performing beyond expectations, but efficiency improvements couldn't overcome labor cost differentials that made American manufacturing uncompetitive with overseas alternatives. Marcus found himself staring at production reports that documented their technical success while confirming their commercial failure, wondering if he'd convinced 400 families to believe in false hope rather than genuine opportunity. The weight of collective disappointment pressed against his chest like physical force, reminding him why he'd avoided taking responsibility for outcomes beyond his individual control. Victoria's response revealed the strategic thinking that had built her industrial empire, as she immediately began developing contingency plans that could salvage the project, even if they lost their primary customer. She'd anticipated this possibility during her initial financial modeling, had identified alternative markets and potential clients who might value the unique capabilities that Millbrook's hybrid production model offered. The key was repositioning the factory from low-cost provider to high-value specialist, serving customers who prioritized quality and flexibility over pure economics. Marcus watched Victoria work with admiration that bordered on awe, making phone calls and scheduling meetings with the focused intensity of someone who'd built her fortune on transforming apparently impossible situations into profitable opportunities. Her confidence became contagious, spreading through the factory like positive virus that inoculated workers against despair and resignation. The solution came from an unexpected source, when Emma's science fair project about sustainable manufacturing caught the attention of a visiting journalist who wrote for Industrial Weekly. Emma had designed a miniature production line that demonstrated how automation could enhance, rather than replace, human craftsmanship, using examples from her father's work to illustrate principles that most adults struggled to understand. Her presentation was so clear and compelling that the journalist requested a tour of the actual facility, leading to a feature article that portrayed Millbrook Manufacturing as a model for American industrial renewal, rather than another struggling Rust Belt factory. The article attracted attention from companies seeking domestic suppliers who could offer both competitive pricing and superior quality, generating new customer inquiries that more than replaced the revenue they'd lost to offshore competitors. Marcus realized that his daughter had become an inadvertent marketing genius, her innocent enthusiasm proving more persuasive than any corporate presentation. The first anniversary of Marcus's hiring fell on a crisp October day that reminded everyone how dramatically their circumstances had changed since his desperate job interview 12 months earlier. The factory was operating at full capacity, with a waiting list of customers seeking production slots and a workforce that took genuine pride in their modernized capabilities. Marcus had been promoted to vice president of operations, with equity ownership that made him a genuine partner in the enterprise's success, rather than merely an employee. More importantly, he'd rediscovered the sense of purpose that had driven his best work at Tesla, the satisfaction that came from solving complex problems while improving people's lives in measurable ways. Emma was thriving academically and socially. Her confidence, boosted by the security that came from knowing her father's talents were finally being recognized and rewarded appropriately. Victoria had essentially relocated her primary residence to Millbrook, claiming that hands-on management was necessary for the project's continued success, but clearly motivated by personal attachments that had nothing to do with business requirements. The proposal happened not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but during an ordinary Tuesday evening when Victoria was helping Emma with homework while Marcus repaired a toaster that had been limping along for months. Victoria looked up from multiplication tables to find Marcus watching them with an expression she'd learned to recognize: the quiet contentment of someone who'd found his way back to happiness after believing it was permanently lost. "What?" she asked, noting how his mechanical work had stopped, while his attention focused entirely on the domestic scene playing out at their kitchen table. Marcus set down his screwdriver and walked over to where they sat, dropping to one knee beside Victoria's chair with the same careful precision he'd brought to engineering problems. "I've been thinking about permanent solutions," he said, producing a ring he'd been carrying for 3 weeks while waiting for the right moment. "Emma and I were wondering if you'd like to make this arrangement official." Victoria's response was immediate and enthusiastic, but Emma's celebration was loudest of all, her shriek of delight carrying through their small house like a declaration of victory over circumstances that had once seemed hopeless. The wedding took place 6 months later, in the factory's main assembly hall, transformed for the occasion with flowers and decorations that reflected both industrial pride and personal joy. Marcus wore the same Tesla watch that had carried him through his darkest years, its battered face now symbolizing resilience rather than loss, continuity rather than abandonment. Victoria's dress was elegant but practical, reflecting the woman who'd learned to balance corporate leadership with small-town authenticity. Emma served as maid of honor with the serious dignity that children brought to important adult ceremonies, her presence transforming the event from simple marriage into family formation. The guest list included everyone who'd supported their unlikely journey: factory workers, community leaders, old colleagues who'd traveled from California to witness Marcus's resurrection from professional exile. Jim Morrison gave a toast that brought tears to eyes unaccustomed to emotional displays, thanking Marcus for saving not just the factory, but the entire community that depended on it for survival and identity. The reception lasted until midnight, with dancing that spanned generations and conversations that wove together past struggles and future possibilities into narratives of hope and renewal. Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah during the quiet moments, wondering if she would approve of the life he'd built from the ashes of their original plans. He'd learned to carry her memory without being crushed by its weight, to honor their shared history while creating space for new love and different dreams. Emma seemed to read his thoughts, appearing beside him during a slow dance to whisper, "Mom would like Victoria, wouldn't she?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that clogged his throat. But Emma's matter-of-fact acceptance provided the permission he'd been seeking to embrace happiness without guilt or reservation. Victoria appeared moments later, extending her hand for the next dance, and Marcus realized that healing had arrived, not through forgetting the past, but through integrating it into a present worth celebrating. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the same spot where he'd once sat in his rusted pickup truck, contemplating failure and desperation while clutching a crumpled resume that represented his last hope for stability. Now he surveyed the bustling factory complex that bore his fingerprints on every automated system, watching workers arrive for shifts that paid living wages and offered genuine career advancement. The parking lot was full of reliable vehicles rather than desperate transportation held together by prayer and stubbornness, reflecting prosperity that had rippled through the entire community like stones thrown in still water. Emma emerged from the main building, where she'd been conducting interviews for her 8th-grade journalism project about industrial innovation, her notebook filled with quotes from workers who credited the modernization with saving their families from economic exile. Victoria appeared moments later, carrying blueprints for the expansion project that would add 200 new jobs over the next 18 months, her corporate confidence now tempered by genuine affection for the community that had become their permanent home. The Tesla watch on Marcus's wrist still kept perfect time, its scratched face catching morning sunlight as he checked the hour before their weekly management meeting. He had replaced the worn leather band with something newer and more professional, but the timepiece itself remained unchanged. A bridge between the man he'd been and the person he'd become through grief, redemption, and the patient reconstruction of purpose from scattered pieces. Emma had asked for a matching watch for her 14th birthday, claiming she needed something reliable to track her busy schedule of advanced mathematics courses and engineering internships that Victoria had arranged with local companies. Marcus had agreed, understanding that some traditions deserved continuation, even as circumstances evolved beyond recognition. The gift would come with stories about time's relationship to healing, about the difference between running from the past and learning to carry it with grace. Victoria's pregnancy announcement came during Christmas dinner, shared with characteristic directness that made Emma shriek with delight and Marcus feel dizzy with unexpected joy. They'd discussed the possibility abstractly, two people in their 40s who'd each lost children and understood both the gifts and risks that parenthood represented. But theory proved inadequate preparation for the reality of new life growing within circumstances they'd rebuilt from nothing. Emma immediately began planning nursery decorations and researching infant development, her 14-year-old intensity focused on becoming the best possible big sister to a sibling who would grow up surrounded by stability and love that she'd had to help create for herself. Marcus found himself remembering Sarah's pregnancy with Emma, the mixture of excitement and terror that accompanied bringing new life into an uncertain world, but this time the fear felt manageable rather than overwhelming, because he'd learned that love could survive even devastating loss. The baby arrived on a Tuesday in July during the hottest week in Millbrook's recorded history, as if nature wanted to test everyone's commitment to their chosen circumstances one final time. Marcus held his son. They'd named him David, after Victoria's father, who'd taught her that engineering could be a form of art when practiced with sufficient care and imagination, while Emma documented every detail with the methodical thoroughness she brought to important projects. Victoria recovered with the efficiency she applied to corporate challenges, already planning how maternity leave could be structured to accommodate both family bonding and operational responsibilities. The factory workers treated David's birth like a community celebration, presenting gifts they'd crafted in the machine shop, and offering babysitting services from experienced parents who understood the village-like support that successful child-rearing required. Marcus watched his expanded family with wonder that felt almost spiritual, grateful for second chances he'd never believed possible. Emma's high school graduation approached with the inevitable momentum that marked all significant transitions. Her acceptance letters from prestigious engineering programs creating both pride and melancholy, as Marcus contemplated life without the daughter who'd been his anchor through the darkest years. She'd chosen Stanford despite offers from MIT and Carnegie Mellon, drawn by research opportunities in sustainable manufacturing that aligned with values she'd developed, watching her father transform industrial processes while preserving human dignity. Victoria had endowed a scholarship in Emma's name, ensuring that other brilliant students from working-class families would have access to educational opportunities, regardless of their parents' financial circumstances. The gesture was typical of Victoria's approach to success, using privilege to create pathways for others rather than simply accumulating advantages for herself and her immediate family. The scholarship ceremony took place in the factory's renovated conference center, now equipped with state-of-the-art presentation technology that Marcus had designed to facilitate both business meetings and community events. Emma spoke about growing up in a family that had learned to transform setbacks into opportunities, about watching her father rediscover purpose through service to something larger than individual advancement. Her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed adult struggles without being crushed by their weight, who'd learned that resilience came through community rather than isolation. Marcus found himself crying openly during her speech, no longer embarrassed by emotional displays that would have mortified him during his corporate years. Victoria reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable intimacy of partners who'd learned to support each other through both celebrations and challenges. David's first birthday party coincided with the factory's third anniversary celebration, creating a festival atmosphere that drew families from throughout the region to witness what had become a model for industrial renewal and community development. Marcus designed special tours that showcased the automation systems, while explaining how technological advancement could enhance rather than threaten human employment when implemented with proper consideration for social impact. Emma, home from her freshman year at Stanford, served as a guide with the enthusiasm of someone who'd grown up understanding that engineering was fundamentally about solving problems that improved people's lives. Victoria moved through the crowds with the grace of someone who'd learned to balance corporate leadership with genuine human connection, equally comfortable discussing quarterly projections with investors and weekend soccer schedules with factory families. The moment Marcus had been unconsciously waiting for arrived during the quiet hour after the celebration ended, when most guests had departed and only family remained to clean up decorations and leftover food. He found himself standing in the exact spot where he'd first met Victoria 5 years earlier, when she'd been a mysterious stranger studying the factory with calculating eyes, and he'd been a desperate man whose last hope for stability had just been destroyed by corporate indifference. The symmetry felt intentional, as if fate had arranged circumstances to demonstrate how completely their lives had been transformed by decisions that had seemed impossible at the time. Victoria appeared beside him, David sleeping in her arms, while Emma collected birthday gifts, with the systematic efficiency she brought to all organizational challenges. "Any regrets?" Victoria asked, noting how Marcus's attention had focused on the past while his family existed firmly in the present. The question deserved honest consideration rather than reflexive reassurance, acknowledgement of the paths not taken and opportunities foregone in service of choices that had seemed necessary at the time. Marcus thought about his Tesla colleagues who'd continued advancing through corporate hierarchies while he'd rebuilt his life in a small Ohio town, about the innovations he might have contributed to projects that were reshaping transportation and energy production on a global scale. The loss felt real but manageable, like scar tissue that marked healing rather than ongoing damage. Only that it took me so long to understand that running away from pain doesn't make it disappear, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. Emma joined their conversation with the timing that suggested she'd been waiting for the right moment to share thoughts she'd been developing throughout her first year of college. Stanford had exposed her to possibilities beyond anything she'd imagined growing up in Millbrook. But the experience had also clarified values that her parents' example had instilled, rather than taught explicitly. She'd chosen manufacturing engineering despite professors who steered promising students toward more prestigious specializations, drawn by the understanding that technology's highest purpose involved improving ordinary people's daily lives rather than simply advancing abstract knowledge. "I want to come back here after graduation," Emma announced with characteristic directness. "Not because I lack ambition, but because I've learned that some things matter more than career advancement." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion that combined pride, gratitude, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his daughter had internalized lessons he'd been afraid he was failing to teach. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. 3 generations of a family that had been assembled from loss and determination rather than simple biology, sharing dreams and concerns while baby David slept peacefully in Victoria's arms. They discussed expansion plans that could transform Millbrook from successful exception into replicable model, ways to share their hybrid manufacturing approach with communities facing similar economic challenges throughout the Rust Belt and beyond. Emma's Stanford education was providing theoretical frameworks for innovations that Marcus and Victoria had developed through practical necessity, creating possibilities for systematic change that could affect thousands of families rather than hundreds. The scope of their potential impact felt overwhelming and exciting in equal measure. Confirmation that individual healing could serve as foundation for broader social transformation when approached with sufficient care and commitment. As sunrise painted the Ohio sky in shades of gold and amber, Marcus realized that his Tesla watch had stopped sometime during the night, its mechanical movement finally succumbing to years of faithful service through circumstances far more demanding than its designers had ever anticipated. The symbolism felt appropriate rather than concerning, acknowledgement that some chapters needed to end before others could begin, with proper attention and intention. He removed the watch carefully, studying its worn face one final time before placing it in his pocket, with the reverence reserved for artifacts that had served their purpose completely. David stirred in Victoria's arms, opening eyes that held the unfocused curiosity of someone just beginning to understand the world into which he'd been born. Marcus reached for his son with hands that bore scars from mechanical work and wedding rings that symbolized commitments deeper than romance, understanding that time's most important function wasn't measurement but meaning, not duration but depth. The story ended where it had begun, with a man contemplating his relationship to work, family, and the communities that shaped identity through shared struggle and collective hope. But Marcus Thompson was no longer the desperate father clutching a crumpled resume outside factory gates that represented his last chance for stability and respect. He had become something rarer and more valuable, a person who'd learned to transform personal loss into public service, individual healing into community renewal, professional expertise into social impact that rippled outward like expanding circles in still water. The factory behind him hummed with purposeful activity, its machines and workers collaborating in the kind of industrial harmony that proved technology and humanity could enhance rather than threaten each other when integrated with sufficient wisdom and care. Emma's laughter carried across the parking lot as she loaded leftover birthday decorations into Victoria's car, the sound serving as counterpoint to David's contented murmurs and Victoria's quiet humming of a lullaby that contained traces of languages from both their backgrounds. Marcus no longer needed miracles, because he'd learned to create them through the patient application of skill, love, and stubborn determination to believe that second chances were possible, even when first attempts had ended in apparent failure. The watch in his pocket had stopped marking time, but the man who'd carried it had finally learned to make each moment count.